The following audio recording has been designed for learning purposes only. Do not share, distribute, or provide any type of copies, or this audio lesson will not be made available to you. Good luck with today's lesson.
That's Andrew Johnson, often considered to be one of the worst presidents ever, in most polls. Buchanan came before Lincoln, Johnson, who came after Lincoln, generally up there in the top three, and then Warren G. Harding in the 20th century. So we're going to move on to chapter 15. I have another vocabulary sheet for you. Certainly there's some things that I talked about last week when I was reviewing that are going to come up again, which I did tell you we'd see it again. So hopefully that will, second time around, will help you remember better. All right. How about if I just you guys pass them that way and you guys pass them this way, and there should be a few left if you could just pass them back up then. Westward expansion is certainly something that had been around since very early in our history, and this idea that the country should exist throughout the American continent, all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Clearly, it's difficult to get to the interior of the continent, and the further people were removed from where the larger populations were, meant that economically it was difficult really to sell any type of produce goods such as wheat because of the difficulty of transporting it out of the interior of the continent, or even cattle. And the Transcontinental Railroad really would change all that. The whole technology of the railroads, of locomotives, would change that. And but nevertheless, even before you see the Transcontinental Railroad, people are moving to the west, although largely out to the Oregon country, and then in small numbers to California. It's extremely difficult to get to the west. There were three options that you had, and none of them were very good. You could travel cross country in a wagon, often a Conestoga wagon or a variety of other kinds. But wagons were small. They generally held all the goods that you would need to set up your life in the West. And so most people walked alongside and behind the wagons. Only the elderly and the very young and whoever was driving the team of horses or oxen would be in the wagon. The rest of the family would walk. It would take several months, about 4 months, depending on how far west you were going. But obviously, if you're going to the Oregon country, at least 4 months. You couldn't leave too early or too late because of the snowstorms in the mountains when you were going through the Rockies. Extremely dangerous. Especially if you leave too late in the summer, you could be caught in a storm in the mountains, and and die. But that was one option. People would leave by this time period from St. Louis, because by the 1860s, before the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, which is only finished in 1869, the railroads connected to St. Louis, just past St. Louis, Missouri. And often what they would do is sell most of their belongings in the east before they left, take what they absolutely needed with them, and then buy supplies once they got to St. Louis, often buy an animal, buy a wagon, to head westward. Your other options were to sail down the Atlantic coast to Panama. In the mid-19th century, there actually was a railroad that connected from the Caribbean, the Pacific, from the Atlantic to the Pacific side, and then go across Panama. That would save about a month's time as opposed to sailing all the way around South America, but, which was about five months or a little bit longer, 6 months to sail around. And so those were your options. And none of them were very good. So homesteading is what the vast majority of people would have done when the government started to offer the option for homesteading beginning in 1862 when it passed the Homestead Act. Remember what I talked about a week ago is that this law was passed because there's, for one thing, no Southern opposition in order to oppose and vote against it, because planters wanted to have huge tracts of land in the thousands of acres, and this provides 160 acres of land, which is a fairly decent size for a family farm. Certainly family farms could often be much larger than that, but 160 acres of land is a decent size. What you had to do is meet 3 stipulations that the government said. You had to improve the land. So that meant that you had to cut down trees and break the sod and farm the land, and then live on the land for a total of 5 years. If you met all those requirements, you could apply for title to the land, free and clear. And so obviously very popular. I love this photograph because it's very typical of 19th century photographs in the last, say, 40 years of the 19th century, 50 years of the 19th century. People love to be photographed showing off their wealth. And so obviously this is a rather meager family living out on the Great Plains somewhere. Maybe the northern plains, because there's a little bit of a hill there. But with the cow up on the hill above the house, very simple house made out of sod. When you would break the sod out on the prairie, the roots of those grasses can go 3 feet or deeper. And so it's very dense, packed earth that you could cut into blocks just like bricks, large slabs, so more like stone, I suppose. And then that would provide the walls for your house in a place where there's very few trees. And here you see them photographed also with their horses, and then the whole family with the kitchen table draped in a really nice cloth, which prized probably tablecloth, and then it looks like watermelon, which is a luxury still at this time. And so they're showing off that they have watermelon here in the summer months. What was really a luxury if you could get watermelon in the winter months, and that was really something. That was beyond most people's means to have. So, and these types of photographs are common in the 19th century. People putting their pianos out on their front porch, a lot of their household furniture, as well as their animals, and all having their family picture taken. Well, because it was not grown here. And so I read a diary of a gentleman who was governor of South Carolina, and he kept a diary in about late 1850s, I think it was, early 1860s, and he talked about having a watermelon that came up from Cuba in December or January, something like that, and what a big deal it was, and how he records, how much they enjoyed it, because historically people ate seasonally, so you ate what was available that was coming in, ripening at the time. So like this time of year, of course, you can go to the farm stands just north of here, or just go to some, Randazzo's just over here on Shaner, and get all kinds of freshly nice ripe fruits and vegetables. But also we can get those types of things that are ripe coming due because they come from Mexico and South America in the wintertime. Well, people did not have that luxury historically. So in the wintertime, people normally ate things that would store well, like cabbages and root vegetables such as carrots and turnips and rutabagas and potatoes. And you're not going to have nice, fresh, ripe fruit historically. The Transcontinental Railroad would make settlement of the West obviously much, much easier, although it would be many decades before the spur lines would be completed. Spur lines are smaller branches of the railroads that would jut off north and south of the main line, like the Transcontinental Railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad made up of the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroads. And here's the photograph of the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific being joined at Promontory Summit in 1862 when they drove the last spike, the Golden Spike, that completes the railroad. It's a huge celebration at Promontory Point in Utah, as well for the whole nation. The newspapers are full of the news of the celebrations as all the top railroad executives went out on special rail cars, luxury rail cars, and dined, had gourmet meals with champagne. And here is a photograph with many of the workers, besides many of the executives who built the railroad. There's one group of people, though, that's conspicuously absent here, and that's the Chinese immigrants who were an important part of building the Transcontinental Railroad. They had a great deal of skills. They were very skilled at weaving baskets. They were really hard workers, and it was the Chinese workers who were the ones that were generally lowered down the sides of the cliffs as they were building the bridges through the mountains. And they, because of the prejudice at the time, they were asked to step aside when this photograph was taken. I talked about the sharecropping system that developed in the South the other day, and how the freedmen were often trapped in that situation, in a situation of work peonage where they were in perpetual debt. And most people were unfortunately unable to leave, but there were small numbers. Remember, there's around 4 million freedmen in the 1860s, and about 20,000 freedmen moved to Kansas in 1879 to make a new life for themselves. And they're known as exodusters. And so the exodusters, unfortunately, largely fail, often because they lacked the money that was needed, and therefore they were unable to afford good quality land. The land that they could buy was often the poorest soil, and on which they settled. And many of them left. Many of them returned back to the South, to where they were from, or some of them headed further west to try to see if they could do better in the far west. So, but the exodusters, as the West opens, as more and more pioneers settle the lands of the Great Plains, you see more farming, often growing wheat, as well as ranching. And because of the railroads, you could transport goods quickly and economically as time went on out of this remote area of the world in the interior plains of the American continent, North America, and out to where the populations were, whether that be on the East Coast of the United States or in Europe or wherever you had a buyer, because the railroad cars could transport the goods and then it could be put on ships and sent out around the world. And this is happening, of course, here in the United States, but also other places in the world as well. In South America, this is happening. You see the colonization of Africa, which largely had not been colonized on the interior. It's a vast continent, and because of the railroads, that's happening as well. So continents are being explored and opened up and settled around the globe at this time, not just here. So American exports, agricultural exports, increase in 40 years from 1.6 billion to 4.3 billion. The Great Plains becomes the breadbasket of the United States, but in some respects of the world as well, because what's happening is with the vast production of grain, it means that people can afford more and more grains, whether it be here or around the world. So prices are going down. This is actually having a negative effect if you actually are, say, a large landowner in Europe and you make your living from your tenant farmers farming your country estates. The English aristocracy were being affected by this because they could no longer afford to maintain their lifestyles like they once did, because the price of grain dropped so much as American farmers produce more and more, and there's an overabundance of grain. An interesting side note to that is that you start to see the English aristocracy, as they're having money problems, then sending their young men over here to America to marry the daughters of the American industrial elite, the multimillionaires that are being made in the late 19th century from the Industrial Revolution. And that's going to come up in another chapter. You also see the aristocracy in England, as well as in other places in Europe, because they're being affected too, but largely in England, selling off their great works of art over the next several decades, often to Americans, wealthy Americans. And part of the reason why some of our museums here in this country have so many great works of European art is because of the financial difficulties that European aristocrats found themselves in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And their families were, which hadn't worked often for hundreds of years, were now forced to divest themselves of some of their family treasures. So as I mentioned, new farmlands opens up around the world as agricultural prices drop. One thing that, an interesting social as well as political aspect of this is that the Grange is founded by Oliver H. Kelly in 1867. The Grange is formally known as the patrons of husbandry. And farmers, of course, historically live a relatively lonely existence after the early settlement. Oh, sure. And farmers, of course, here in the United States, historically, although not in the very earliest settlement periods on the East Coast because of the need to live close together, but historically live surrounded by their fields on their land. And the Grange was founded in the 19th century as a social and educational and fraternal organization. So provided social needs of the community. People would have potlucks. They would bring in speakers, often educated in the new agricultural ways and ways of raising animals, husbandry. Because, of course, with the passage of the Land-Grant College Act at the time of the Civil War, you see new agricultural colleges springing up around the country, like Michigan State here in our state. But the Grange also had an economic aspect to it. They opened their own co-ops, so cooperatively owned stores. They would build their own grain elevators and warehouses to store grains. And the reason why this was important was that you could say in a time of low grain prices, the community could come together, store their grain in a community-owned grain elevator, and then when prices went up, if you didn't need to sell when the prices were so low, you had this option that they could be stored, and then when prices went higher, you could sell it. So, so there was this aspect, and co-ops as well meant that you could buy in bulk. So co-op stores, you could save money. It's the same idea as belonging to Sam's Club or Costco even today. And then what comes out of this is, of course, people talking about the problems within society, often complaining that big corporations were always getting the breaks. You know, these multimillionaires who own the railroads are friends with the multimillionaires that own the factories, and the big companies would often pay the lowest rates per pound because they were shipping so much. And then the little guy was always paying the top rate that the railroads were charging. And so, so the Grange starts to become interested in politics, and after or during the time of the Panic of 1873, when the economy is collapsing. So Grange goes into politics. Small independent political parties grow out of the Grange initially. And in 1874, they actually win control of 4 state legislatures: Illinois, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Minnesota. And what comes out of that, then, is some of the first regulation ever in this country on businesses. And regulation in the 19th century is extremely minimal. So, and in general, very unpopular with business leaders, which of course we find it often is today. But I think it's important when you study history to realize why regulation came about. It's not to necessarily punish people, but it's actually in order to protect the vast majority of the population from often the excesses of big business, which don't necessarily always have the public in their best interest, because they're often more concerned of their own profits and making profits for their shareholders who own stock in their companies. Which is their main goal, and which of course is legal, but sometimes to the detriment, and often health-wise as well as economically, to the general public. And so you had farmers exerting their political might by electing people who supported their views to those state legislatures. And what the state legislatures then begin to do is ban railroads from offering preferred customers special rates, as well as setting maximum rates for transporting or storing grain, because they were often paying exorbitantly high prices per ton. I was, regulation is often in the news and something that's hotly debated today, just as it was over 100 years ago. And I was reading a newspaper article the other day talking about how regulation on the coal industry is being weakened and how they believe it will lead to 1,400 more deaths per year because of that. So I think that's a modern example of how big business doesn't necessarily have the interest of the public in mind. As the population of the West grows, large numbers of people, of course, are either farmers or ranchers. You definitely see the growth of cities. And here's an example, Denver, Colorado, for instance, which in 1860 had a population of only 2,600 people. So relatively small town by even 19th century standards. And it grows to 100,000 people only 30 years later in 1890. Settlement of the West, of course, is oasis-like. And so it really depends on access to water. And so that's why even today you see settlement of the West quite sporadic. The majority of the population still lives east of the Mississippi, not west of the Mississippi because of water issues. Of course, there were water programs that eventually would divert water to areas where large populations normally could historically never exist, like, for instance, Phoenix. Phoenix could not exist without diverting water from the Colorado River. Cattle ranching, as I mentioned, is one of the things that happens is that more and more longhorn steer are raised. It was a Spanish tradition, of course, because the American Southwest was for hundreds of years Spanish possession, and there was the tradition of eating red meat in the Iberian Peninsula in Spain, and which is then brought to the Americas in the colonial period. The white Anglo-Saxon Protestant tradition is not that big on eating beef. Certainly eating a lot of meat when they can get meat, like say lamb or mutton, but guinea hen, actually, even over chickens. I did some research on that in the 19th century. Often guinea hens were more common than chickens even. But Americans historically didn't eat a lot of beef. The nutrients or the amount of calories that Americans ate was always historically, even going back to the colonial period, was always higher than their European relatives. And actually the amount of meat that Americans or English colonists first ate was always more than their European relatives. So people tended to have better diets here in the English colonies and then in the United States, and live longer as well. But they didn't eat red meat, and so this becomes quite common. And Chicago will become the epicenter of the beef industry. Steer will be driven from ranches in Texas to places like Colorado and Kansas. Abilene, Kansas was the end of the trail for about 20 years until you get into the 1870s. Finally, when spur lines are finally completed and you can start to ship cattle all the way from Texas up to Chicago on the rails. And but Chicago becomes a major meat packing industry. So you have the development of refrigerated rail cars in the late 19th century, which allows for the sale of fresh beef. It can be the steer can be slaughtered in Chicago, and yet the beef, the good cuts of beef, can be shipped out across the country in refrigerated rail cars, or for that matter, put on ships with refrigerated rooms and then sent anywhere in the world as well. And that's quite significant because Historically, the meat that people ate came from within a very short distance of where they lived, from a local butcher that butchered an animal that was raised within just 5 or 10 miles from where it was butchered. Or you might be buying it directly from a farmer that may be butchering it. All this development with the taste for red meat, with the railroads, with the refrigerated rail cars, led to the demise of a lot of small butchers in this country. Many of them went out of business because of this large meat industry that grows up in Chicago, not just fresh meat, but then canned meats, pickled meats. Sometimes they refer to it as mystery meats because they would use all kinds of innard parts that would be ground up to make different types of canned meats. Very, unusual. Actually, the factories themselves were not especially clean. There's a large expose done in the early 20th century on that would lead to legislation that we'll get to later on. But Chicago is at the center of it, and which, if it hadn't been for technologies like the railroads and then the building of the Erie Canal, connecting Chicago both by rail as well as through the Great Lakes, and then out to the Erie Canal and down to New York Harbor, that would never have been able to happen because it's so far on the interior of the American continent. And here's just an image of the longhorn steer being herded into a boxcar to be sent up to Chicago. Mining is now, many people have the ability to invest in exploration of the American West for minerals, and so you see mines coming about. Minerals, certainly some minerals are like gold. People will travel anywhere across the globe to get gold, or certainly silver. Is an important mineral that people will travel around the globe to get. But many minerals would just have been not valuable enough. Copper mines, for instance, in Arizona will open up. And it's because of the railroads you can ship the copper out. But the Comstock lode is probably the most famous mining operation in the West in the late 19th century. And it's the largest find of silver ever in American history. In the late 19th century, $400 million worth of silver over the course of many years is extracted from the Comstock mine at Virginia City, Nevada. And its four major owners were John McKay, Jim Fair, James Flood, and William O'Brien. I put their names down just because I wanted to point out that in a future chapter we'll be learning about the Gilded Age and how the ultra-rich lived. And Jim Fair's daughter will come up because she'll build a huge mansion in Rhode Island where she'll spend just a few weeks a year at. It's her summer cottage. So. I haven't yet mentioned Native peoples, but certainly Native Americans were losing their rights to their lands. Many Native Americans, of course, had been forced off their traditional lands east of the Mississippi earlier in the 19th century, forced to move west of the Mississippi, where they were told it would be their land forever, that no white man would go there. But then, of course, with the railroads and the settlement of the West after, in the last half of the 19th century, Native peoples are moving in larger numbers onto reservations, being forced to move onto reservations. And we tend to clump Native Americans all into one big category. And I think it's important to note that there are um, several hundred tribes in what's the United States, all often with similarities, but many with, of course, their own distinct cultures, but the similarities being things like they're polytheistic overall, that they worshipped many gods, that they're often a matriarchal society in which the women did the farming besides raising the children, and it was the men did the hunting. The men were often criticized by Europeans and Americans for being lazy because there was this misunderstanding of Native American cultures going back to the earliest days, that the European colonists would see the women doing the planting and the harvesting besides all the other work around the village, and the men would be off hunting. And in Europe, those who hunted were the aristocrats, the king and his court and the aristocracy. And so it was something that only the very elite did. And so when you see Europeans coming here to the New World, they see that's what the Indians are doing, and they're saying, oh, look at those guys. They have nothing better to do. What they didn't realize is that they're actually providing for their families by hunting the wild game that was out there. And that was part of their culture. That was how they displayed their manhood, to go out and hunt and kill animals or go off to war, because Indian tribes warred against each other as well. So, but that's how they provided for their families. And there was that misunderstanding about the hunting that then led for centuries to this idea that Native American men were lazy, and that was not true. You have what's known in the last decades of the 19th century as the Indian Wars, with this, these conflicts between settlers as well as the federal government, federal troops, with the native tribes of the West. And clearly you can take whole classes on this. You can get an entire degree on Native American culture. And unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot of time to deal with, there's just so many topics in a survey class. So I thought I would highlight 3 of the major conflicts between the United States government and tribes in the West. The Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1867, and then what's seen as the last conflict, the end of the Indian Wars, the Wounded Knee Massacre in December of 1890. So the Sand Creek Massacre occurring in Colorado Territory, 1864, so at the time of the Civil War, in which federal troops attack a sleeping group of native peoples, largely women and children that are killed in that attack, merely because local settlers, white settlers, were nervous that they were living in the area. Out in the Great Plains, which eventually you'll have the Battle of Little Bighorn, but which should have never happened because of the Fort Laramie Treaty, which had been signed in 1868. The Fort Laramie Treaty had granted the Sioux the ownership of the Black Hills. It barred white people from Sioux lands, and it granted hunting rights out in the Dakotas, Wyoming, and Montana to the native tribes. And it said that the land would forever be theirs. It's very sacred land, the Black Hills. But unfortunately for the tribes of the Black Hills, in 1874, everything began to change. So you know what the Black Hills are famous for? Besides their great beauty, natural beauty. Think about jewelry. The gold, Black Hills gold, which I'm not sure if all of it is pink, but I've seen Black Hills gold as pink. So in 1874, there was a government expedition led by George Armstrong Custer and the Southern Cavalry, but also you had those that were brought out searching for minerals by the government. So the government actually is going against their treaty. They launch an expedition into the Black Hills trying to bring interest in settlement of the Black Hills. And they do that by sending out the Southern Cavalry. The Southern Cavalry will end up protecting the miners then that will come out, those prospectors that come out once they hear of the discovery of the gold in the Black Hills. So the government actually is going against their own treaty. And we see here in this photograph a large number of troops and supplies, because you had to bring lots of supplies from the east. And so in all these covered wagons. Of course, this will enrage the tribes of the Black Hills, and it will lead to the Battle of Little Bighorn on June 25th, 1876, which is referred to as Custer's Last Stand. George Armstrong Custer, of course, was one of the heroes of the Civil War. He was on General Grant's staff, and of course he was a local guy. He was from downriver in Monroe, here in Michigan. And he, like many officers that served in the Civil War, wanted to remain in the military when the war ended. But the problem was that during the Civil War there were a lot of generals, and now that the war was over with, there wasn't a need for generals, and so he actually takes a demotion and then remains in the military. The Battle of Little Bighorn, of course, is a battle in which the Southern Cavalry will lose. The Cheyenne and the Arapaho will win this battle. They knew the lay of the land. It was their land for going back for centuries. And they were able to surround the Southern Cavalry and kill them. But you know, while native tribes people could win battles, in the end they couldn't win a war. In some sense, it's like the Civil War. It was a war of attrition. Who could hold out the longest? And people that live in a traditional manner cannot have a standing army, such as a modern industrial society like the United States. You cannot they could not have soldiers that served 365 days a year, year in and year out. That was impossible. And so native tribal people could only serve, fight in the warm months, but then in the winter they would have to go back to ensure their family's survival in the winter. They would have to hunt to make sure that there was enough meat and animal skins and things like that, keep them warm. So that is why, in the end, of course, the native peoples will lose the war. They can't stand up to a modern, equipped army. It was so here we see George Armstrong Custer, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer on the left, and Chief Sitting Bull on the right, who led the Indians in this battle. Actually, there was another battle just a few days prior to this battle in which troops had fought against the Indians. It was called the Battle of Rosebud. Often gets ignored. So this is actually the second battle within a matter of about a week or 10 days in that span period. Chief Sitting Bull, of course, famous Indian chief in this area, actually would become well known not only because of this battle, but because later on, for a short period, he would actually become part of the Wild West show, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, which was the most famous and popular of Western-style circus-like shows at the end of the 19th century. So here's a short clip about Sitting Bull and this period. Oh.
He was the leader of the Hunk.
He was the leader of the Hunkpapa band of the Teton Sioux, or Lakota.
Sitting Bull's rise to power comes from spirituality. And I really believe, looking at Sitting Bull, looking into his eyes, I think you can see it.
Sitting Bull led by example. He had a history of bravery. He had the charisma. He embodied, for the Lakota, the kind of person they needed at a point when they were facing cataclysmic change in their lives, when presented with the challenge of white civilization.
In 1868, the Fort Laramie Treaty had created the Great Sioux Reservation, which encompassed most of the modern-day state of South Dakota, as well as millions of acres of hunting grounds to the west and north, including the Black Hills.
The Black Hills was a breath of life for the Lakota. Not only was it a place to get food, it was a place of extreme holiness. It was a place where they would be born, it was a place where they would live, they would die. It was their backbone. It was a place that was their creation.
By the terms of the treaty, these lands had been granted to the Sioux forever. And in return, they were supposed to cease their hostilities against the Americans and live peacefully, accepting rations from the government at offices known as agencies on the reservation. The majority of the tribe had followed this course. Sitting Bull had nothing but scorn for the Sioux who had chosen life on the reservations. You are fools to make yourselves slaves to a piece of fat bacon, some hardtack, and a little sugar and coffee, he said. Sitting Bull remained defiant, a symbol of resistance for his people. On July 2nd, 1874, General George Custer and the 7th Cavalry set out west on an expedition to the Black Hills.
Not a general anymore.
Everybody knows that this is an expedition whose purpose is to get the public interested in seizing the Black Hills. Custer is there not just to explore the Black Hills, he's there to publicize the discovery.
It's a tremendous affair. 110 wagons. There are geologists, botanists, 4 newspaper reporters, and probably the most important people of all, 2 miners who are there to search for whatever minerals might happen to be there.
It's 1874 when the news hits the public that there's gold in the Black Hills.
By the fall of 1875, just over a year after Custer's expedition to the Black Hills, more than 15,000 miners had flooded into the region. The government had offered to buy the Black Hills for $6 million, but the Lakota had turned them down.
The government's interest in the Black Hills would, in a sense, play into Sitting Bull's hands. He was really looking for a way to pull his people together in the face of this threat coming from the east.
Sitting Bull has decided that he will not negotiate with the United States government, and he continues to recruit Indians who want to come out with him during the summer and hunt. He's trying to gather a kind of Lakota resistance to this incursion.
And soon the Little Bighorn Valley is teeming with life. A vast pony herd numbering in the thousands. And not just hundreds of people, but in the great camp circles there are thousands upon thousands of people. Perhaps the greatest gathering of native peoples on the northern plains in its history. For Sitting Bull's people, there's no place to run. There's no place to go. This is it. I mean, this is the last great defense of the Lakota homeland.
Custer had been ordered to force them onto the reservation or destroy them in the process.
And then it was the unfolding of what has become known as the Last Stand, where you have, just basically a handful of people surrounded by this huge force.
The cavalry didn't have their heart or their spirit into their fight, whereas Sitting Bull and the rest of those warriors did. It was their land. It was their last stand. They were fighting for something completely different to a certain extent. They were fighting for their survival. They were fighting for their life.
They say that Sitting Bull must have studied Napoleon to defeat Custer. That he was a spy who graduated from West Point and then had gone back to the Sioux and had become, this genius, a military genius for the Sioux.
They couldn't accept the fact that Custer was beaten by American Indians. And some of the press even went so far as to say that Sitting Bull really wasn't an Indian. They didn't want to accept the fact that an Indian or Indians outsmarted them.
There were immediate calls for revenge, and the Army of the West dispatched new columns of troops to track down the Indians. By the fall of that year, virtually all of the Lakota and Cheyenne would be forced back onto the reservations. Only Sitting Bull remained unyielding, living with his band of 5,000 Lakota in Canada.
And if you look at the date of the Battle of Little Bighorn, June 25th, 1876. 1876, of course, is an important year in American history, and especially in the summer of 1876 is important because there's huge celebrations that are going on. The Philadelphia World's Fair is going on at this point to celebrate America's 100th birthday. The big celebration on July 4th nationwide will be coming up, and it's really, so this happens just before these major national celebrations for our centennial, and so, which obviously is very upsetting to the country that this disaster in the eyes of the public at the time had occurred. Of course, there's really not the thought at this time that that these are traditional lands that actually belong to these people, that maybe we're doing something wrong. It's seen that no, this is our God-given right, and that was the viewpoint of the time. And there's this viewpoint that if Native peoples cannot assimilate, then maybe they should be wiped out. And that's often a viewpoint that's taken especially by people who lived in Western lands in close proximity to the Native peoples. Often in the East, if there was an atrocity like some type of a massacre where many Native peoples were killed, people in the East that hadn't lived by tribes for hundreds of years would actually say, well, we're doing something wrong. This shouldn't happen. But so there's various viewpoints going on at the time, and obviously, the government is forcibly taking this land only a few years after they had agreed that it would be the people of the Black Hills land forever. And so that is a major issue that would not be settled till late in the 20th century, in which the Supreme Court heard a case that was brought before it by the native tribes of the Black Hills, saying that the government had gone back on their treaty and had taken the land from them. And the Supreme Court decided that the government needed to pay for it. The tribes refused to take the money. And so the last I read is that the money was put into an account and it's accruing interest. But the tribes of the Black Hills still see that land, because it's seen as such sacred land to them, that it needs to be returned. So there was this, I mentioned assimilation. There was this idea that the people, once they were put on the reservation, that they needed to start behaving more like white Americans. And so they actually, young children are taken from their parents off the reservation and forced into boarding schools in which they are forced to wear Western style clothing. They can no longer wear their traditional clothing. They have to cut their hair to conform with the style of white people, so they're not allowed to keep their hair long like the men. Native American men, of course, wear their hair long traditionally, and they were forced to have it cut short. The children were not allowed to speak their native languages either when they were taken to these boarding schools. And so the government tries to eradicate these people's heritage and their culture. And can you imagine how devastating that would be, to be removed from your family and forced to go live somewhere else with a bunch of strangers telling you that everything about your way of life is wrong? So a terrible, traumatic situation that these children found themselves in. The native peoples had little choice. They were unable really to survive on their own after the destruction of the buffalo herds that roamed the Great Plains by the millions. And this was actively encouraged for hunters to go out and shoot the buffalo. Buffalo were just left to die. Often their hides would be taken, but the rest of the animal was often left to decay. Sometimes what would happen is, after the animal decayed, people would go out and collect the bones, and it would be shipped back east and made into like bone meal, things like that. But the buffalo, of course, was the major source of life for native peoples out on the Great Plains. And when buffalo no longer existed, then people had to depend on the federal government. That in the treaties, there were the ways the treaties were written up would generally say that a certain amount of food would be delivered every year in order to feed the population. And sometimes there's stories about live cattle arriving at a station near a reservation, and the Indians waiting for the train, and then the boxcar being opened up, and the young men jumping on immediately jumping on the cattle and slitting their throats and killing them right there. And then the white people who were there would write about how barbarous this was and horrible. But what they didn't realize was that this was a way that young men proved their manhood, went from being a boy to a man, was by going out and killing the buffalo, and they could no longer do that. And so what they would do sometimes, from what I've read, at least in one account that I've read, talked about how this is how they would then prove their manhood. So buffalo hides were so prevalent in this country in the last few decades of the 19th century that it's said that everybody in the East, in the Northeast, who had sleighs, everybody had a buffalo blanket, a buffalo hide blanket, to keep them warm as they traveled in their sleighs during the winter. But by the turn of the 20th century, because actually I'm doing research on the buffalo, I'm hoping to write a book about saving the buffalo. I'm working on research on the guy who's saved the American buffalo. And by the early 20th century, buffalo hides became so expensive that nobody could afford them. So it went from, in say the 1870s, 1880s, from being something that everybody could afford because they were so cheap that by about 1905 or 1910, they became so expensive that nobody could have one anymore. After the peoples of the West have been, for the most part, forced onto the reservation by the late 1880s, Congress decided that the government needed to acquire more land for settlers in the West. And it passes what's called the Dawes Act, or officially the Dawes Severalty Act, in 1887, which will work to break up reservations and force Native peoples to assimilate even more into Western culture. They wanted the tribal people of the West to begin to live like white settlers, live on individual plots of land. And so just like the Homestead Act that provided 160 acres of land for settlers, the Dawes Act, if people in these tribes would agree to it, to give up their rights to the tribal lands, they would each get 160 acres of land for each heads of a household, so adult male, that was 18 years or older. And unmarried members of the tribe that were younger than that would get smaller plots of land if they gave up their rights to the reservation. This was really about taking more land away from the native tribes. And then Congress in the Dawes Act does something that's quite extraordinary for Congress in the 19th century, that it granted citizenship to those Indians that agreed to take the land according to the Dawes Act. So Indians did not get American citizenship in the 19th century. It's not until the 20th century that they're granted citizenship. So it's very interesting in the way that the government historically approached the tribes, because they always viewed that the Indians had the legally owned the land on the one hand, but on the other hand, they viewed that they did not really have the right to keep legal title to the land and would have to give it up. And in these treaties that were made over the course of over a century.
I think if this happened now, it would be shot down immediately by Congress.
You would hope so, but you never know what, 'cause we live in unusual times.
Even now, isn't there like state IDs in Native Americans denied, like as identification?
I imagine that is maybe going on. I just read an article last night that people that live in southern Texas near the border that were born in this country are being denied passports, and some people have been arrested. So, and the government saying they weren't citizens. So I would not doubt that. Reservation land technically is a foreign country. So if you do go to an Indian reservation, which there are reservations here in Michigan, if you go to a casino, technically, I suppose, you are in a different country if it's actually on a reservation. So I remember the first time I learned that, and I was like, I mean, I never realized that, oh, I guess that makes sense if it is seen as a legal government. The tribal councils are legal governments, and the land is technically not in the United States. It's part of the continent, but it's not legally part of the United States. A friend of mine, when he was working for General Motors, he was doing some testing on some of their cars out west, and a lot of times, highways will go through tribal lands. And they were always warned that you have to remember that you are leaving the United States when you're if you're testing and you're driving these cars really, really fast on some of these desert roads. The ghost dance in the Plain States becomes popular at the end of the 19th century. The idea of the ghost dance is something that goes back in history and is something that had historically been practiced by tribes in the Americas. Part of the belief of the ghost dance, which is essentially like a prayer, is that in which the people who would dance it would dress in white and wear white makeup. And historically, the idea was that it would raise your ancestors from the dead. But then part of what the ghost dance meant to tribes in the late 19th century was that it could bring the land back, it could change the land, it could bring you back to a time before the white people existed by bringing a scourge to the land. And so the idea was that if you danced the ghost dance, that it would wipe out all the white people, and there would be a great plague or fire that would come across the land, and you would all the native Indians would be raised up as the scourge occurred across the land, and then they would be brought back down, and times would return to how it had been for their ancestors before the white people came. And so that's at least one belief in why people did the ghost dance. And it terrified, as you can imagine, the white pioneers who were living out on the plains near the tribal lands. And federal agents who were in charge of the reservations banned the ghost dance from being performed. And it led to a great deal of tension between the government and the white settlers and the native Indians in the West, out in the northern plains. And it is, the ghost dance is really what leads to the Wounded Knee Massacre. This is actually just before the Wounded Knee Massacre. Federal agents were sent out to arrest Sitting Bull, who has returned to the United States. They talked about how he had been living in Canada, but then they tried to arrest him. He's actually shot and killed at that time. And then some Indians flee, and the reservation and government soldiers are sent out to find them. And they were rounded up at the end of December 1890, and on the morning of December 1890, they were the encampment of men, women, and children were going to be sent to back to the reservation. And the men in that morning were told that they have to give up their firearms. And the soldiers were in the process of disarming the warriors when it's said that an elderly warrior who was hard of hearing was unwilling to give up his gun. And it was believed that he didn't understand what was going on. And somebody starts shooting. And they're not exactly sure where the first shots came from. But anyway, the young American federal soldiers panicked. They were inexperienced. And the way that the Indian encampment was guarded, it was guarded with Hotchkiss guns, which are a late 19th century version, kind of an early version of a rapid fire gun, so like a machine gun. It's not quite a machine gun, but it's on the way there. And so it can fire off large rounds of ammunition. And the soldiers panic, and they begin firing into the crowd of men, women, and children. And actually, as the people are running away, not actually even fighting, a lot of them are shot in the back. And then they are, reporters will go out a few days later, and there's, if you ever get your book, there's actually a picture in there. I don't, for some reason I didn't find a picture. Or maybe I didn't find the right size picture and I wasn't able to put it here in this presentation. But there's a photograph in your book depicting actually this horrific scene with the frozen bodies a few days later, because this is obviously winter on the northern plains, so it's extremely cold. There was a great outcry by the American public in the East to wanting to know what exactly happened, how could this happen, all these women and children that are killed. But there was a congressional investigation into what occurred. The commander of the troops was investigated, but given a very, a reprimand, but that's about it. Nothing really happened. So, but the Wounded Knee Massacre is seen as the last real conflict between the federal government and the Native Indians in this country. And it's essentially it's seen as the end of the Indian Wars then. And because really not much had happened anyway throughout the 1880s, but this is really seen the very end. And by the 1890s, it's really seen that the West has been conquered, and now what's going to happen? Where are people going to go now that we've taken all of this land, and what's to become of us? Because of course, for over a century, every generation knew that when the land was plowed up and taken by too many people where they lived, the next generation could move further west and settle on the next plots of land, and then further and further west. And that happened throughout the 19th century. And now what was going to happen? So, then what we'll be moving on to in the next few weeks is we'll be talking about what happens after the West is settled, and what's the outlook of the American public, and what's the government thinking. We have to start becoming more like Europe, that we have to start taking territories for ourselves that don't adjoin the American continent. So we start to look at Alaska and Hawaii and Pacific Islands and the Caribbean, things like that. So that's all going to be coming up next. So anyway, I know we're done a few minutes early. I'm not sure how that happened, because I did this exact same lecture yesterday and we got out at 1:45. But anyway, enjoy your extra few minutes, and probably because I talk too fast. Again, just if I'm talking too fast, just let me know and I'll slow down or back up. But enjoy your Labor Day weekend, and I'll see you next Tuesday.
Good luck with today's lesson.